4 minutes ago, the royal council chamber opened, and the British monarchy came out permanently changed. Camilla's title had just been stripped from her by the formal council order and transferred directly to Catherine. But honestly, the announcement wasn't even the most shocking part. As the final words were read aloud, Camilla reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. Then her knees gave out. She collapsed right there in the council chamber, in front of the same people who had just taken away the royal position she'd spent decades fighting to secure. And suddenly, what had started as a private palace power struggle had turned into something genuinely frightening. This whole situation got so much worse during a very tense palace meeting. Camilla stood completely humiliated as the royal council read out the verdict that stripped her of her duties. This council is a private group inside the palace, built to advise the crown on its most serious decisions. And once this council passes a decision, it takes effect immediately. That's exactly what happened here. The council voted, the vote passed. And just like that, Camilla's official duties were stripped from her on the spot. But here's where things got dangerous. The council could remove those duties immediately, but only temporarily. To make Camilla's removal permanent, Charles himself had to sign the final order. Until he did, the decision wasn't sealed. The door was still open for Camilla to get everything back, and nobody in that room knew whether Charles would sign. So, while that signature line sat empty, every privilege, every official duty, and every ceremonial responsibility that had just been taken from Camilla passed directly to Catherine immediately. Camilla somehow held her face together through all of it, until the secretary said Catherine's name out loud. That's when something inside her cracked. Charles saw it. He watched his wife's expression change right in front of him. And you know what he did? Nothing. He stood there and said absolutely nothing. Then the secretary read the final sentence that took all power from Camilla. At that moment, she reached out and grabbed the back of the carved chair beside her. Then, in a whisper barely loud enough for anyone to hear, she said, "This cannot be final." Seconds later, her knees gave out. Charles finally moved. He rose from his seat and started toward her, then stopped halfway. He just froze. William moved first. He called for help, and staff rushed in to lift Camilla from the floor. Then William looked over at his father, and what he saw wasn't a king in control of the room. He saw a man completely defeated, trapped between protecting his wife and protecting the crown, knowing he could no longer do both. And here's where this whole mess got even worse. Catherine knew absolutely nothing about any of it. She wasn't even inside the chamber. She had been deliberately kept away so nobody could turn around later and accuse her of pushing for Camilla's downfall. That protected Catherine's reputation. But it also meant she was about to receive some of the most explosive news of her entire royal life with absolutely zero warning. And somehow, that still wasn't the darkest part, because beside the official order sat another document, a sealed appendix. Basically, an appendix is an extra document attached to the main order, containing additional terms that were just as binding. And most people inside that chamber weren't even allowed to read this one. What it contained went far beyond Camilla's title. It locked down her staff, her residences, her access to official briefings, and every piece of ceremonial authority she still had left. Only 3 people had actually read what was inside. William was one of them. He looked down at the final page, and that's when he saw it. Right there beneath his father's name, the signature line was completely empty. Charles had not signed it, and that changed everything. Without Charles's signature, Camilla's fall wasn't permanent. Everything that had just happened could still be reversed, which left one enormous question hanging over the entire palace. Why hadn't Charles signed? Was he deliberately protecting Camilla, quietly leaving one last door open for his wife? Or had he allowed the council to go this far, only to panic when the final decision landed in his own hands? Nobody knew, and suddenly, that one empty signature line became the most dangerous question inside the entire palace. But to understand why Charles stood there completely frozen, and why William looked at his own father and saw nothing but defeat, we have to go back. Because this didn't begin inside that council chamber. It started weeks earlier, with 2 women, Catherine and Camilla, who smiled beside each other on the same balconies, stood beneath the same palace lights, and represented 2 completely different futures for the crown. And Camilla knew exactly how fragile her own future was. She had never believed her position inside that family was completely safe. For years, she faced public hostility, private suspicion, and the constant fear that the palace had learned to tolerate her without ever truly accepting her. So, every ceremony she attended mattered. Every time she stood beside Charles, as his wife mattered. Each one proved that after everything she'd been through, she was still there. So losing her title didn't simply feel like punishment. To Camilla, it felt like the palace finally confirming the fear she'd carried for years. Maybe her place there had never truly been permanent. Catherine took a completely different road. She built her influence slowly, through duty, family stability, and years of discipline in public. She rarely challenged anyone openly. William watched that influence grow year after year, not because Catherine demanded more power, but because the two of them worked as partners. And one moment showed exactly how Catherine felt when all of this suddenly landed in her hands. She sat with the council letter on her lap, staring down at the final paragraph. William stood beside her, close enough to see the shock all over her face, but he didn't say a word. Then Catherine finally spoke. "I never asked to take anything from her." William told her he knew, and he meant it, because he understood exactly how ugly this position was. Catherine was gaining enormous power at the exact moment another woman was being stripped of hers. He explained that the transfer was never meant to reward Catherine. The council had framed it as a safeguard against something much bigger, a constitutional and personal crisis. Basically, they believed the rules and stability holding the monarchy together were now under threat. And here's what made that especially brutal for Charles. He had once privately promised Camilla that her position would always be protected. Now, he was being forced to choose between keeping that promise to his wife and protecting the institution he'd sworn to defend. Catherine looked at William and asked the obvious question. What could Camilla possibly have done that was serious enough to make Charles break his own word? William paused, because honestly, this whole mess didn't begin with some legal memo or giant public scandal. It started weeks earlier at one royal ceremony, with one decision from Camilla that pushed the palace past its point of no return. It started at the Windsor investiture rehearsal, a formal ceremony where honors were presented on behalf of the crown. Before the rehearsal, Charles had personally approved the official receiving order. Catherine was supposed to stand at the front and receive the guests in her role as Princess of Wales. But before that instruction reached the staff running the ceremony, Camilla stepped in. She ordered an aide to remove Catherine's name from the front of the receiving line and put her own name there instead. And that was already serious because Catherine hadn't chosen that position for herself. The king had personally put her there. Camilla had just changed his order, but then the palace discovered something much worse. This wasn't the first time. For months, Camilla had been using her control over several household channels to quietly alter palace decisions after they left the king's office. These channels were basically the internal system through which schedules, invitations, seating orders, briefings, and ceremonial instructions reached palace staff. Camilla still had enormous influence over that system, which meant an order could leave Charles's office saying one thing and reach staff saying something completely different, and that was the real problem. Catherine had been moved from positions Charles personally assigned her. Invitations approved for William and Catherine's office had reportedly been changed before reaching staff. Ceremonial instructions had been rewritten. On several occasions, Camilla's own household had been given priority where Charles's original order gave it to the Prince and Princess of Wales. Basically, Camilla wasn't just throwing her weight around. She had allegedly created a second chain of command inside the palace. Charles would approve one thing as king, and Camilla could quietly change how that decision was actually carried out. Most people never noticed because all of this happened behind closed doors, but William had started noticing. Anne had too. And eventually, Charles was shown 3 separate directives that had left his office with one set of instructions, and somehow reached palace staff with another because Camilla had changed those instructions. And that's what made the Windsor incident so serious. By then, Camilla had already been warned to stop interfering with decisions that came directly from the king. Yet, when Charles personally approved Catherine's place at the front of that receiving line, Camilla changed his order anyway. At that point, this wasn't really about Catherine anymore. The queen had been warned to stop altering the king's orders, and then she did it again. And inside a monarchy, where everybody beneath the sovereign needs to know exactly whose instructions are final, that was a massive problem. Palace staff were now being put in an impossible position. Whose orders were they supposed to obey? The king's or the queen's? That was the pattern the council could no longer ignore. And something had happened just 1 week earlier that made what came next even more personal. Camilla and Catherine arrived at the same public engagement outside a hospital. Camilla stepped out of her car first. Catherine followed seconds later. And the second Catherine appeared, the crowd erupted. People surged toward the barrier, calling Catherine's name, phones shooting into the air, everyone trying to get her attention. And Camilla? She barely got a reaction. Standing just behind her was one of Camilla's own senior aides. He leaned toward another staff member, looked at the crowd screaming for Catherine, and muttered, "That's the difference now." What did he mean? It was painfully obvious. Catherine had become the woman the public wanted to see. Camilla is the queen, but Catherine is more popular. The aide clearly thought Camilla couldn't hear him. She could, and that had to sting. But Camilla said nothing. She carried that humiliation away with her, and it sat with her for days. Then came the Windsor investiture rehearsal, where Camilla ordered an aide to remove Catherine's name and put her own there instead. William found out before the rehearsal even began. He followed Camilla into a side corridor and asked her, calmly and carefully, why she had changed an instruction personally approved by his father. Camilla didn't apologize. She looked William straight in the eye and told him Catherine needed to learn the difference between popularity and rank. Camilla was talking about what happened outside that hospital. Yes, Catherine was more popular. Yes, the crowd screamed louder for her. But in Camilla's eyes, that did not give Catherine the right to outrank her inside the palace or take a position ahead of her at a royal ceremony. William understood exactly what that meant. Camilla was allowing that rivalry to affect official palace decisions, even when those decisions came directly from Charles. And Anne? Anne heard enough of that corridor exchange to understand exactly what had just happened. She found Charles alone and told him straight. This was no longer some petty disagreement between two women in the family. His wife had just challenged the future structure of the crown, and by extension, she was challenging the future William and Catherine were being prepared to inherit. At this point, it was clear that Camilla would have to severely face the consequences of her action. That evening, Charles summoned Camilla to confront her with everything William had uncovered. William waited outside, expecting Camilla to apologize or finally admit what she'd done. Instead, the argument exploded behind closed doors. Voices rose. Then the door slammed open and Charles walked out with a decision William never expected. He was taking the entire case before the Royal Council for a formal review. And here's what made that decision so serious. This confrontation hadn't happened in front of photographers or a room full of advisors. Only William and Anne were there to witness what happened. Charles placed the orders Camilla had changed on the table in front of her and asked one very simple question. Had she deliberately changed his instructions after he approved them? Camilla didn't deny it. Instead, she turned straight on William. She accused him of taking advantage of his father's reduced workload to build his own little court around Catherine and slowly push the older generation out. Camilla expected Charles to defend her. He didn't. Instead, Charles demanded an apology and told her to surrender control of the household channel she'd been using to send instructions to senior staff. And that was huge. That channel was one of Camilla's strongest sources of influence inside the palace. Through it, her office could communicate directly with senior staff about schedules, ceremonies, invitations, and briefings. Take that away, and Camilla could no longer quietly step into those decisions before they were carried out. Camilla refused. She told Charles that giving up that control would leave her powerless inside her own marriage and exposed to everyone who had spent years waiting to watch her fall. Then her voice tightened. She reminded him of the promises he'd made to protect her long before that crown ever touched his head. That's when Anne finally spoke, and she came prepared with something much harder to explain away. Weeks earlier, a junior aide in Catherine's household had received an urgent briefing meant directly for Catherine. Normally, it would have passed through Camilla's office first, but because the information was urgent, the aide sent it straight to Catherine's private secretary. Within days, that aide fired, and Camilla's fingerprints were all over that decision. Anne told Charles she'd personally checked the file after hearing similar complaints from two other staff members. Both were too frightened to put their names to what they were saying, and now this had become much bigger than a fight between Camilla and Catherine. Palace staff were afraid that bypassing Camilla, even to get important information where it needed to go, could cost them their positions. People inside the palace were starting to fear the system they were supposed to trust. Camilla pushed herself back from the table. She warned Charles that if he allowed this review to continue, he would publicly destroy everything he'd once promised to protect. Then she walked out and closed the door behind her. Charles stood there completely still. After a long silence, he asked the question nobody in that room could answer emotionally. Could the council actually strip Camilla of these powers without his full approval? And the answer wasn't going to come from love, marriage, or family loyalty. It was going to come from the rules governing the crown. Behind the throne sat constitutional advisors, household authorities, and senior royals responsible for keeping the monarchy functioning. And by now, their concern wasn't that Camilla had insulted Catherine. It was much more serious. Could anyone trust the king's orders if his own wife could secretly change them before palace staff carried them out? By the time Charles entered the council chamber, the recommendation had already been written, reviewed, and placed on the table beside an uncapped pen. Charles stopped and read the first page without saying a word. The council review examined Camilla's ceremonial title, her authority over palace staff, her access to internal information, and the powers attached to her position. Basically, they were deciding one thing. Could Camilla safely keep those powers after repeatedly using them to interfere with the king's own instructions? William and Anne sat apart from the advisors. They had influence, certainly, but they didn't control the decision. Charles would be the one to decide. But before that, William gave the king a sealed appendix. The appendix showed that Camilla's office hadn't only changed instructions. Several important briefings meant for Catherine had also been held back inside Camilla's office. Others never reached Catherine at all. One of those files concerned a major national ceremony. Because the briefing had been delayed, Catherine had nearly walked into that ceremony without information she needed, in front of senior officials and foreign guests. One mistake in that room wouldn't simply have embarrassed Catherine. It could have embarrassed the crown in front of the country and foreign representatives. And that's when Charles finally understood how far this had gone. At that point, the council agreed to transfer Camilla's title and authority. But Charles asked for one final night. That night, he told her he could surrender the title herself, keep some ceremonial privileges and part of her personal staff, and let the palace tell the public she had chosen to step back gracefully. Camilla said nothing. She waited until Charles left. Then she tore the unsigned statement in half. She claimed that signing it would erase her entire life. Before dawn, Camilla formally rejected the proposal in writing, and that was it. Hours later, the council turned its recommendation into a binding order. Charles spent that night alone in another wing of the palace, devastated that his final attempt to protect Camilla's dignity had failed. By sunrise, the punishment was already moving through the palace. Staff were told that by midday, Camilla's offices, duties, and reporting lines would transfer to Catherine's household. Inside the council chamber, Camilla's embossed official folder was removed and replaced with one bearing Catherine's name. Neither woman was there to see it, but Camilla found out in a much more humiliating way. That morning, she called her longtime personal assistant from her private study and asked her to handle something routine, the kind of request she'd made hundreds of times before. The assistant hesitated. Then she told Camilla she could no longer take instructions from her directly. As of that morning, she reported to Catherine's office. Any request from Camilla now had to go through Catherine's household channel first. Camilla went quiet. She asked the assistant to repeat herself. Then she put the phone down without even finishing the call. The power Camilla had refused to surrender voluntarily had now been taken from her anyway. She couldn't even give a routine instruction to her longtime assistant without going through Catherine's office. After recovering from her earlier collapse, Camilla refused to speak to Charles. Instead, she asked for a private meeting with Catherine. Catherine agreed, even though William warned her that Camilla might pressure her into rejecting the title. When they met, Camilla went straight to the question she'd been waiting to ask. "Did you know about all this?" Catherine answered immediately. No, she hadn't known the council would act that morning, and she had never asked for Camilla's removal. She admitted that receiving the transfer document had left her shaken, not triumphant. That's when Camilla finally dropped her guard. She admitted that Catherine's popularity had frightened her. Every crowd that cheered louder for Catherine, every new responsibility William received, and every reduction in Charles's workload made Camilla feel like her own place inside the monarchy was disappearing. And instead of accepting it, she fought it. Then Catherine admitted something Camilla wasn't expecting. She had considered refusing the title. William stopped her. He warned that refusing it would reopen the entire power struggle and weaken the council's decision. At that point, Camilla did something no one expected. Till now, no one could say whether it was a genuine act or whether she was planning something sinister. Either way, she spoke again, and there was no bitterness in her voice. She told Catherine not to make the same mistake she had. A royal title could give you power, but it could never guarantee that your place was safe. Catherine understood exactly what she meant. She promised her first public appearance wouldn't celebrate Camilla's fall. She would acknowledge the pain behind the transfer. By that afternoon, the story had escaped the palace. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Crowds gathered outside the gates. But the image that defined the day wasn't Camilla's collapse or the sealed council order. It was Catherine stepping out of a car without a smile, wearing no celebratory jewels and carrying a handwritten statement. The palace released a formal bulletin confirming the transfer, but it left out Camilla, changing Charles's orders, the delayed briefings, and the staff members who had become afraid to challenge her office. The country split almost immediately. Some called the decision necessary discipline. Others called it the public humiliation of the king's wife. Charles stayed completely out of sight and asked for the television to be switched off. Before Catherine stepped out of the car, she removed a prominent ceremonial brooch. She refused to look like she was celebrating another woman's fall. That evening, one newspaper ran the headline, "The Crown Changes Hands." Beside it were two photographs, Camilla leaving through a side entrance, Catherine approaching the main doors. Catherine's handwritten statement honored Camilla's years of service and promised stability, duty, and respect. Not one word about victory. Later that day, Charles went to Camilla's room one final time. Her ceremonial seal was already gone. Her official folder had already been removed. Charles placed his hand on the table between them, his wedding ring still on his finger, and told Camilla he still loved her. But love couldn't protect decisions that had repeatedly undermined his authority as king. And finally, Camilla stopped fighting. She admitted that fear had driven her choices. Catherine becoming more popular frightened her. William gaining more authority frightened her. Even Charles reducing his duties frightened her. The monarchy was moving forward, and Camilla was terrified it was moving forward without her. Charles didn't reverse the order. He told her their marriage would continue. She would still be his wife and stand beside him. But her power inside the institution was finished. No more senior decision-making. No more household channels. No more ability to interfere with instructions after they left the king's office. That evening, a handwritten note from Catherine arrived for Camilla. She promised to use the title to stabilize the family, not erase Camilla's years of service. Camilla lost the title she once believed would secure her place forever. Catherine accepted a burden she never asked for, and Charles learned that protecting the crown sometimes meant refusing to protect the person he loved from the consequences of her own choices. The palace didn't celebrate. It simply moved forward, wounded and reordered, but finally certain about who would carry the monarchy into its next chapter.